Hi everyone, my name is Liam Bean. I'm a grad student at Montana State University in the Department of Geography, and today I'd like to share a little bit of work that me and my advisor, Dr. Sarah Church, are beginning very soon. We'd love to share a little bit about what we're planning to do with you all and get some critical feedback. So the question that motivates me to do this work the most, or the problem, is that despite all the attention to science literacy and science education, right, there's still a lack of trust in science in the US. We see this in the flat earther movement, we see it in the anti-vaccine movements, and we of course see it in the denial of the climate crisis and the refusal to adopt conservation behavior. Many researchers have spent time trying to understand and theorize why there's so much anti-science movement, and others have spent time thinking about the solution. One of the solutions that comes up a lot is increasing our informal science education programs, specifically through citizen science and volunteer water monitoring. And we do know that these programs have a lot of benefits. People walk away with greater trust in science, and they walk away with a greater ecological and scientific literacy. But there's often this assertion that throughout these programs, the participants will then go home and spread their new knowledge and their new trust in science throughout their social networks. And that's kind of what we want to look at. Are these informal science education benefits being spread throughout an area? And also, are the data being generated by these projects even being used by decision makers? That's another thing that's very, very important to us as well. So we really want to address what is public participation in scientific research, right? What is citizen science? And it really is any scientific investigation where members of the public serve at any role. We know that it has science education outcomes. A lot of them are talked about as scientific literacy, but when you break down what people are learning from these programs, often it's not larger scientific ideas like systems thinking or how to put together an experiment, but is more narrow into what the program is looking at. So a volunteer water monitoring program, a lot of people walk away with knowledge of their water and the ecosystem, but they may not walk away understanding how to put together a volunteer water monitoring program. And we think that that fits a little bit better with David Orr's understanding of ecological literacy. These participants are becoming more ecologically literate, but maybe only marginally more scientifically literate. We also know that there is a selection bias. People who choose to participate in these programs are often highly motivated about science, right? They already have high trust in science. When we're looking at what we mean by trust, we want to adopt the framework of saliency, legitimacy, and credibility. In this work, we're trying to remove credibility as much as we can. And we'll talk about that later. Saliency would be what is important to people. What data do people want? What data do people need? Legitimacy, what's trusted, right? What data is seen as legitimate, whether or not it's credible. Finally, we want to talk a little bit about social learning, and we want to acknowledge that all informal science education is a social learning process. It's almost always learning from others. It's very rarely experimentation. It's a lot of learning by contact. This is a typology of public participation in scientific research that came out in 2009. It's widely used throughout the field and occasionally modified or expanded upon. You may see that as we move right along this typology from a contributory project to a co-created project, the large difference is the increased engagement of non-professional scientists. We may see in a contributory project, the main role of the non-professionals is simply to record data. They're almost a tool, while in a co-created project, their role is to be scientific investigators themselves. Most volunteer water monitoring programs are straddling the middle. They're collaborative projects. They're projects where a lot of the data collection and analysis is being done by volunteers and non-experts, but a lot of the questions, methods, hypotheses are all being determined by professionals. A really interesting way to think about this is to think about contributory projects as having a low power sharing model, while a co-created project has very high power sharing. And we think as we move across this kind of power sharing these stages of power sharing, what we're expecting to see is that the volunteers on the right, the ones in more contributory projects, are going to be larger proselytizers for their projects. They're going to be the ones spending time in their social network, talking about what they did on their weekend, and potentially changing people's trust and understanding of science. So we're going to boil this down into a few simple goals. The first is seeing how the typology, that structure, that organization affects the volunteer scientific and ecological literacy. This has been explored a lot. We're not going to explore this as in depth as other work. There have been many surveys and quizzes getting at this, but we do need to confirm it and see how it may be different in our cases. Next, we want to look at how that same typology, how that same structure affects the diffusion of benefits to watershed communities, to wider areas. We expect to see that same thing that I talked about earlier. As we move to the right, as we engage the volunteer more, we expect to see a larger diffusion of benefits. And finally, I'm a geographer, so I'm always concerned with space and place. We want to know what spaces does the diffusion of knowledge occur. Is this happening in bars? Is it aligning with the idea of barstool science? Is it happening in churches? Is it happening during community meetings? Are people lobbying decision makers to use data that they collected? These are the kind of things that we want to know. We want to know where they're happening. We also want to know if these conversations are happening online. What's the reach of them? And we're mainly going to investigate this through interviews that are supported by document analysis and some map-assisted protocol, and if we can get to it, some observation. As I said before, our primary data collection is going to be through interviews, and what's making our work distinct is that we're going to address not just volunteers and program managers, but we want to talk to key decision makers and other non-participants. We also want to use map assistance in our interviews, whether that's participants being able to place points on a map where they've had conversations, or just being able to correct our understanding of the watershed and come to a more collective understanding of what this space is to them. We're going to support that with that document analysis, as we said before, mainly looking at social media posts and news articles that we scrape off the web, as well as looking at the sampling plans that these programs put together, their training guides, potentially their goals, and reviewing some legislation that was either ignored the data collected or maybe was built with the data in mind. And finally, a lot of these programs like to put on large events. If any of those large events we are able to, as members of the public, to attend them, then we will be doing a little bit of event observation. But this is the least important of our three data collection methods, right? This one is, we may leave it by the wayside. So to choose our cases, we started with a large funnel to remove a lot of the volunteer water monitoring programs in Montana, because we are a state that is flush with them. First, they had to measure quality. Some programs only measure quantity. We needed at least one quality measurement so that we could compare between programs. Then we didn't want programs conducted by a federal, state, or local government entity. They had to be an outside organization, but still have an approved sampling plan. Earlier, I talked a bit about removing credibility from the equation. This is what I mean. When we look at programs that have approved sampling plans, we're only looking at scientifically credible sources. We then took this large funnel and built several comparison groups and selected cases that fit in several different ones. One of those groups was the number of paid staff. If a program has a lot of paid staff, we expect higher numbers of volunteers and maybe higher volunteer engagement, which may lead to a larger footprint of diffusion. We looked at programs in an urban context and a rural context. Those of you familiar with Montana may believe we have no urban context here, right? Our largest cities are barely scraping 100,000 people. But we think we'll see a large difference in the diffusion of information between Great Falls and the Muscle Shell. Finally, we looked at program maturity. We expect older and more mature programs to just have higher and more engaged volunteers, people who are more committed to proselytizing their information and getting that out there and talking to their social networks. Here is the map of the programs we selected. As we can see, they're all in the state of Montana. Montana has a couple of interesting biomes, and we can see a really strong divide with the Rockies and sort of the beginning of the plains over here. And you'll notice that there's an area of extremely low population in the Northeast with very few programs. We did try and select a relatively wide geographic spread. We didn't want anything too close, but we do notice that the Galton Stream Team and Madison Stream Team do form a small cluster. And there's actually another monitoring program just a few miles south of Bozeman in Big Sky. So there's a lot of water monitoring happening in a very small area. So the slide I want to end on is just a couple of our interview questions. And remember, we're designing around those core questions of information diffusion, scientific literacy, and ecological literacy. So here is an example of a question we may ask a non-participant or a decision maker, right? We're very much asking about, have people talked to you about this? And then we can further prompt about where and when and what kind of people. A question we may ask a program manager or a program participant is, hey, where have you been going to have these conversations that we just talked about? Something I'm interested in is if these conversations are being facilitated by the internet, and if they have a much wider reach than we may have expected in the past. Imagine somebody's Facebook comments reaching people all over the United States about their water quality monitoring experience. Is that something that's happening? And if it is it important? I think that our interview design is really going to be the key to this work and getting some salient information. And here's where I would love some feedback or ideas. So in this research, we're asking a lot of big questions and a lot of weird questions, and that, of course, wouldn't be possible without our funding through the Montana Water Center and the dedicated work of our co-PI, Dr. Adam Siegler, who is a water quality specialist out of MSU Extensions. He's done a ton of water quality education, so he knows what questions are salient, he knows what information we need to gather, and he can also evaluate our work and make sure that what we're saying fits with the understanding of water quality professionals. So I'm going to end here on our obligatory questions slide. I just want to remind everyone that I'm also soliciting for some critical feedback, for some suggestions on how to improve the work as we are just beginning it. Feel free to email me or Dr. Church if you have any more questions that we can't get to, especially if you have feedback or a line of thinking. Her Twitter is much more active than mine, but I would love to see a Twitter message. I think that would make my day. Thanks everyone for coming. I very much appreciate it.